Welcome to the Pinoy Guard channel. Today, we will discuss a historic event that has marked a significant stride in the maritime security of the Philippines. The latest vessel of the Philippine Navy, HMS Spey, P-234, has arrived at the Sangley Point Naval Base in Cavite. In this video, we will delve into the details and significance of this vessel's arrival, and how it will strengthen the defense of Philippine waters. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on the latest information regarding maritime security and the progress of the Philippine Navy. Today is a historic day for the Philippine Navy. The newest offshore patrol vessel, OPV, ordered by the Philippine Navy has finally arrived at the Sangley Point Naval Base in Cavite. This new vessel is named HMS Spey, P-234, and belongs to the River class produced by Bay Systems surface ships in the United Kingdom. The arrival of HMS Spey, P-234, is part of the Philippine Navy's Capability Development Program aimed at strengthening maritime patrol capabilities and national water security. The Philippines has ordered a total of 3 River-class vessels from the UK with a contract value of 9 billion Philippine pesos. Prior to HMS Spey, P-234, the first vessel, HMS Tarlac, P-77, arrived in the Philippines in 2021, while the third vessel is expected to arrive in 2024. With a length of 90 meters and a width of 13 meters, HMS Spey, P-234, is capable of various missions such as patrol, surveillance, maritime law enforcement, search and rescue, and disaster relief operations. The vessel is equipped with advanced equipment such as radar, sonar, and light weapon systems. It can operate continuously for 30 days without refueling. The arrival of HMS Spey, P-234, was personally welcomed by the Chief of the Philippine Navy, Rear Admiral Toribio Adachi Jr. He conveyed a warm welcome and appreciated the excellent cooperation between the Philippine Navy and Bay Systems. The arrival of this new vessel will strengthen our Navy's capability to protect national water security. I am confident that this vessel will make a significant contribution to Navy missions, said Rear Admiral Toribio Adachi Jr. The welcoming ceremony for HMS Spey, P-234, was attended by dozens of Navy personnel along with their families. They appeared enthusiastic about seeing the new vessel. One Navy personnel named Captain Leo Gonzalez mentioned that the arrival of the vessel is significant, stating, "With modern vessels like this, I am confident that our Navy's capabilities will improve. We can carry out patrol missions more effectively." After the welcoming ceremony, the group conducted a tour of the vessel to inspect its facilities and equipment. They were impressed by the spacious and comfortable interior design of the vessel. Command rooms, engine rooms, bathrooms, dining areas, and even the helicopter deck were well designed to support various operational needs. I am thrilled to be on board this vessel. The design is modern and the facilities are complete. This will undoubtedly help us work better, said Communication Officer Petty Officer 2nd Class Maurice Calderon. She expressed hope to soon embark on the vessel for patrol missions at sea. After the welcoming event, HMS Spey, P-234, will undergo a series of tests and crew training. The vessel is expected to become operational soon to support Navy missions, especially in the western waters of the Philippines. The arrival of this vessel marks a significant step for the Philippine Navy in strengthening its maritime patrol capabilities to safeguard national sovereignty and water security. Hopefully, this new vessel will positively contribute to enhancing maritime security in the Philippines. In February 2021, the Philippine Navy officially announced its plan to purchase a second River-class offshore patrol vessel from the UK. The selected vessel was HMS Spey, P-234, belonging to the same River class as the first vessel, BRP Gabriela Salang, PS-17, which has been operational in the Philippines since 2018. The acquisition of this second River-class vessel is a crucial step for the Philippine Navy to enhance its patrol and surveillance capabilities in the vast waters of the Philippines. River-class offshore patrol vessel. The River-class offshore patrol vessel is a specialized patrol vessel designed and built by Bay Systems for the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom. The vessel has a length of 84 meters, a width of 13 meters, and can achieve a maximum speed of 24 knots. It has a carrying capacity of approximately 90 personnel. This class is designed for high-capability maritime patrol missions, including operations in coastal and open waters. The vessel is equipped with advanced equipment such as radar, sonar, and automatic weapon systems to detect and counter threats at sea. Some other safety features include electronic monitoring systems, tracking and tracing systems, and anti-sea mine systems. As a multifunctional patrol vessel, the River-class is also capable of performing missions beyond patrol, such as search and rescue operations, disaster assistance, and maritime diplomacy. The vessel can operate for up to 30 consecutive days at sea without logistical support, allowing it to conduct long-range patrols in the widely dispersed waters of the Philippines. First purchase of BRP Gabriela Silang in 2015, the Philippine Navy decided to strengthen its fleet by acquiring the first River-class offshore patrol vessel from the UK. After a negotiation and delivery process that took almost 3 years, the vessel named BRP Gabriela Silang, PS-17, finally arrived in the Philippines in February 2018. BRP Gabriela Silang was officially commissioned in April 2018. Since then, the vessel has been actively involved in various critical missions for the maritime security of the Philippines. Some of its main tasks include patrols in the waters of northern Philippines and the Philippine Sea to prevent illegal activities such as unauthorized fishing, smuggling, and other crimes. Surveillance of the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone and enforcement of laws in those waters. Natural disaster relief operations, such as assisting victims of tropical storms and earthquakes. The vessel was assigned to help victims of a tropical storm in the Visayas region in 2019. Maritime diplomacy with neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Taiwan. The vessel frequently makes visits to strategic partner ports in the Philippines. Joint exercises with the navies of the United States, Japan, Australia, and other regional countries to enhance maritime security cooperation. BRP Gabriela Silang has proven to be highly valuable for the patrol capabilities and disaster response of the Philippine Navy. The vessel can perform various missions effectively.